So welcome everyone to the released item analysis for the New York biology test. So to introduce myself real quick for y'all. So my name is Brendan Finch. My pronouns are he, him. You can tweet at me at birdbrainfinch. I taught middle and high school science for 7 years. I have been working since 2014 on 2 different things. So Rocket Lit is what I left the classroom to build. It's an adaptive science reading program. So you can read science articles at different reading levels. It's pretty cool. And then in the last 5 years, we've been building Inner Orbit, and that really just focused around NGSS and NIST assessments. And I spent a lot of my time originally writing the items on the site, and now I'm spending most of my time speaking with thought leaders to build resources and tools to better support administrators. So some of that is happening right now. Y'all are in this webinar, but we're also building other cool things that we're testing out, and I'm excited to share it with you when we get to that point. And I just want to state for the record that I believe canned salmon is superior to canned tuna in every way. I'm not sure if you like tuna salads, but if you're concerned about mercury and still want all the benefits of the fish, anyways, canned salmon is good. All right, so really quick before we dive in, I want to introduce you to Inner Orbit if you're not already familiar with the platform. I know for a fact many of you on the call are because you use Inner Orbit, but it's a quick little reminder of what we do. So Inner Orbit is pretty simple. So we find phenomena, and those are real world things that can be explained with science knowledge. And so we find examples of these things, we pull data sets, we pull resources or GIFs or research studies, and we kind of package them in ways for students to try to make sense of what they're seeing. And along with those phenomena, we write a bunch of very, very deeply scaffolded and specific questions so that teachers can assign questions to students, they can get data, and they can respond to that data. So that data is really, really specific, where we'll say things like, for the developing and use models SEP at the middle school level, they struggle the most with developing a model to describe unobservable mechanisms. But students were wildly successful with using a model to test cause and effect relationships or interactions concerning the functioning of a natural or designed system. So each of these things are elements within the grade level bands of the SEPs. And so for developing these models, we've got a whole bunch of little things that students need to do, and we just want to collect data on those things. Also, we have been doing a lot of professional learning. So you're going to find us doing virtual professional learning, not just these webinars, but targeted learning sessions with school districts. And so if you're interested in us modeling classroom strategies, if you're interested in gathering some feedback on teacher progress, that's a big, big deal with a lot of our partners in New York, where they're looking to gather information on how are teachers progressing with their knowledge, their comfortability, their like understanding of these standards. And so we would love to help with that as well. We do in-person sessions as well. So there's Erin hanging out with a bunch of teachers in Norwalk, Connecticut, and I go out there sometimes. My colleague Kate does, and we'd love to see you and meet you and work with you in person if that's something you're into, or you can engage with us virtually. And on to our main topic. So we're here to talk about the New York biology released item analysis. I'm excited about this. I was a biology teacher and I loved teaching biology. So all biases acknowledged, and let's move on. So our objective is to provide context for the upcoming biology New York Science test through reviewing Sensemaking and then analyzing some released biology test items. So we want to give you opportunities to understand Sensemaking and also understand the biology items, because those two things go hand in hand. We cannot do one without the other. We're going to be here for an hour. Sometimes I promise it's going to be 45 minutes, and that's just not what happens. So I'm just going to say it out loud. We're going to be here for an hour for our agenda. So we're going to take about 15 minutes to introduce ourselves or reintroduce ourselves to Sensemaking. We're going to look at what's the difference between old items and new items. And the focus in this session is just exclusively on biology teachers. So if you're a bio teacher, this is 100% for you. If you're not a biology teacher, then, So we'll talk about what three-dimensional standards are as well. It's a really, really important basis of what Sensemaking is, and we always like to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about translating standards into assessments, and we're going to look at that through 3 different lenses. So the first lens is we're going to look at standards, so the performance expectations. And then we're going to talk about the evidence statements. And then finally, we're going to look at the PLDs. And then we're going to talk a little bit about calibrating assessments with PLDs. We're going to talk about what proficiency is for these PLDs. And then we're going to talk about what PLD level is this, and we're going to look at some items that are from the current regions test and from the release test items and an in-orbit item as well, because that's always fun. And then we're going to talk about using phenomena authority unit. We're going to get into it, like this T cell and this cancer cell here, and learn about some biology released items. So onward. All right. First, we're going to start with an intro to sense making. I want to give you two different items, and I want you to consider the differences or maybe similarities between these items. One of them is a Regents 2023 Living Environment item. The other one is a 2024 Biology Released Test item. Fun stuff. So item number one says, this is the Regents item. It says, which statement most accurately describes the expected effect on the carrying capacity of a population if a change in a factor occurs? So what is the expected effect of the carrying capacity of a population if a change in a factor occurs? And so it lists a bunch of different factors that we can look at for changes. All right, item number two, this is from the coral reefs cluster within the release test items. And so we're looking at stress in coral reefs, and they give, I'm not going to read this entire thing, but we're talking about zooxanthellae and coral and the symbiotic relationship they have, or mutualistic relationship. And so I guess those are similar. So we're looking at changes in current and ocean conditions that affect coral reefs, and also looking at changes in open temperatures and the trend line that we see from 1900 until 2020 or whenever this data ends. And they ask the question, they say, use evidence from the information provided to support an explanation of how biotic and abiotic factors affect the carrying capacity of shell-building organisms, such as corals, in a reef ecosystem. All right. Two different questions here. And my ask of you is, what is the difference in what these two questions are asking students to do? So what is the difference in what we're asking, or what these two questions are asking students to do? Let's go ahead and respond in the chat. Finding 23 is asking to find the correct combination of factors. And the newer one is asking students to using evidence from the info, not just their knowledge. And I really think that the comment on analyzing data from more than one source is super interesting. So there's two different data sets here, looking at ocean temperatures and ocean conditions that are happening there. That's interesting. I'll give you another minute to write responses in there. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Just to acknowledge a couple other things in the chat. So the second one connects acidification to issues with shell building organisms. And there's also a cause and effect relationship that we're looking at between the biology released items. I would argue, just for the sake of argument, that the regions does connect some cause and effect. So the number of snowshoe hares would increase if the population of Canadian lynx, a predator, also increased. And so there, you could argue that there's some cause and effect in some of those questions, the cause of, like increasing the number of predators to the effect of, probably decreasing the number of prey or maybe competition for prey or whatever it is. So I think you could make an argument the multiple choice question has that as well. All right. Awesome. Thank you all so much for responding. If you have a response and you're like writing it and you're like, I don't know if I should send, you should send it, because getting the different answers is super, super, super interesting. Cool. And then another person, I think that may have actually been sent to hosts and panelists instead of to everyone. So you may want to change the little blue thing from hosts and panelists to everyone right above where you wrote. But they said, so in 2023, they have to analyze 4 different scenarios. In 2024, they go more in depth on just one scenario phenomena. So I really, really like that. Yeah, thank you so much for resending. So that one scenario is the whole focus is just this, ocean acidification, how that impacts shell building and ocean temperatures. And it's just this coral reef phenomena. And the other one is just kind of like, there are lots of different phenomena. I would argue that I don't know that the regions involves 4 scenarios, because those are just kind of, all you're looking at is predators and prey, grass and rabbits. And so I think you're really just looking at relationships between consumers, producers, decomposers. Yeah, I think also the multiple choice versus the constructive response makes a big difference. Cool. Great responses. I love it. And if you all agree or disagree with the things I'm saying, please tell me in the chat because it's always really, really interesting for us to have a conversation about this. So I want to kind of offer one lens to look at these different questions through, and that is the lens of sense making and representation. So if you've been with us in other slides before, in other sessions before, this is a familiar thing, and I just love talking about it. So representation is kind of what that old Regents question is. So students have ideas they've learned. So as predators increase, that's going to decrease the numbers of prey. As like the number of foxes increases, it'll impact the number of hares that will lower and more grass can grow or something like that. So just really, really simple connections between ideas that students have learned. It's important for us to recognize that students need to learn things. And if you're diagnosing where they're at with their knowledge, that's great. If you're formatively assessing, so how are you progressing towards, your understanding, then that's great as well. Those are things that we need to do. However, it's insufficient evidence of proficiency. And we're going to dig into the PLDs in a little bit and take a look at what that first question looks like relative to the performance level descriptors. And the second question is, it's approaching sense making. And so this is explaining why or how to make sense of a novel phenomenon. It is not just predator and prey, it's this one specific thing. And all of these factors, complex, there's multidimensional factors that are going into what's happening to the coral. This is great for a summative assessment. You could give sense-making assessments as formative assessments as well, but I think and the idea with the New York State test is it's going to be the final assessment. Now, can you show me what those ideas mean in this novel context? And so this is mastery of a standard. It's the goal of the NGSS or the NISLIS. So super, super important that we make sure that whatever standards we're holding students to, we may use representation questions. It's important for practice, but we have to give them opportunities to make sense of novel things because that's what they're going to have to do on the test. And frankly, that's what the world is demanding right now. If we just offer students representation things where they can communicate ideas they've learned, the reality is that all of the information that they will ever need is available to them on the internet, in their pockets, or right in front of them on a computer. So being able to take new information, integrating that, and making sense of novel scenarios, that's really what the future is about for these kids. I mean, beyond just the state test. Like, this is the future. So let's prepare them for that. That's really, really important. All right. So what are three-dimensional standards? This is, derived from decades of research. And what we're looking to build is a pathway to STEM and to science understanding and for critical thinkers for the future. That's the big, big idea. So three-dimensional standards are pretty simple things. Just kidding, they're not. So we have three different dimensions that are integrated together into this thing that we call a performance expectation. So usually we'll see the content, that's what students know, that's the DCI or disciplinary core idea. So these are the same with the NGSS and the NISLIS standards. The DCI is just, students know things, there are relationships, there are interdependent relationships in ecosystems, and that impacts the carrying capacity, how many individuals of a population can be supported by that ecosystem. And that is something that students should know. They need to know that, like relationships between organisms impacts carrying capacity. But the standards, the NGSS and the NISLIS, say you need to do that through representation, so mathematical and computational thinking. And more specifically, it says use mathematical and or computational representations of phenomena or design solutions to support explanations. So they need to use mathematical representations. We're going to go into what those are exactly in the slides that follow, but that's an important part. And so that first question that we looked at, that Regents question, there's no mathematical representation in there. It's just a predator, prey, consumer, decomposer, and the primary consumer, secondary consumer relationships. So there's nothing in that is allowing them to use mathematical representations. That's important. The third dimension are how students think. I like to phrase this as the lenses that students can use to analyze and make sense of the world. And so scale, proportion, quantity is really important when considering things like ecosystem level changes. Just because, there's more plants in like one small area, or let's say there's more kelp in an area, or like a storm comes through and really messes up some huge kelp bed that was there, that may impact a small area. But if the entire ocean increases by 1 degree centigrade, that is it's a global scale issue. And that has significantly greater impact on an ecosystem than that one, like gnarly event that may have happened in a smaller area. So scale is really, really important when looking at the impacts of changes in ecosystems. And that's what this cross-cutting concept is all about. So I like this one. All right, so these are baked into this thing at the top here, which that is a performance expectation. And so as was mentioned in the chat earlier, performances are the basis of what we want students to do with these new standards. So you have to use mathematical and or computational representations to support explanations of factors that affect carrying capacity of ecosystems at different scales. So you can see the scales in there. You've got the mathematical and or computational representations, and you've got carrying capacity and the factors that impact that as the DCI. So you have three different dimensions in there. And so when we're looking at assessment items, we're going to look at integrating that knowledge and those SEPs, the science and engineering practices, and the cross-cutting concepts into those questions. So questions like this right here, where we're using evidence from information provided, multiple sources of information, not just a single source. There's text, there are several different images that are included in this. So these are the phenomenal three-dimensional type of items that we want to give students. This is really important, and we stress this all the time, that just looking at these items and seeing what we used to ask students to do and now what we ask them to do now, there is a big, big difference. They don't look dissimilar on the surface, but from what they're made from, it's just not the same at all. Great. So this isn't just something that I think and I'm saying. I want to walk you through. So Achieve is the organization that built the NGSS standards with state partners, and they have this really cool project called the Task Annotation Project in Science. But they say that assessments should look less like having students represent exactly what they've already learned and experienced. So I used to do this in my classroom when I started teaching, be an exit slip on the thing that we talked about in class. So if we talked about the fact that, more predators lead to less prey, or, more of one group leads to more competition within that group, I would ask them that direct question at the end of the lesson, usually about the exact thing that we talked about. Students should not be explaining a phenomena or addressing a problem that they fully understand. So there should be uncertainty in what they're doing. And also they should not be providing a factually correct or incorrect answer. Ideally, there are interpretations involved here, and it's not just a right or wrong thing. That's really, really important. We want students to look more, or assessments to look more like, so where students are connecting what they've learned and experienced in a new way. So we need them to see new things. Their reality that they're going to experience in 10, 15 years it's just not what we're living through right now. So we have to give them novelty. In addition, they need to connect their learning to a phenomena or a problem that involves authentic uncertainty. So these students need to be authentically uncertain about this thing. If there's a familiar phenomena, happy day, good times, that's great. But the problems they're going to have to solve in their future are unfamiliar phenomena. And they need to be authentic, because if we ask students to do rigorous things, tough things, and they're not invested in them, you can't have high expectations in that scenario. It needs to be a real problem, something that actually is happening. So I think ocean acidification, changing temperatures, these are examples of, these are real problems. They're happening right now. And that is much more compelling in terms of motivation and engagement for students. And they need to make their thinking, including evidence-based reasoning, visible. And they can do that through models, explanations, arguments, investigation plans, questions, and or predictions. So that's just a much more deeper engagement that we're looking for. You can ask multiple choice questions that allow students to explain their thinking or identify thinking, but obviously those free response questions are a big, big thing. All right, so great. Thank you all so much for walking through those three-dimensional standards and looking at kind of the shift in assessment. Now let's talk about translating those standards into assessments. And I'm going to go through a couple of different tools here that we have used and that you should consider using as you're translating those standards, so the expectations of the standards, into what you're doing for instruction, and then how you're assessing students' progress on that instruction. So first off, there's the performance expectation. So Exhibit A is something you're probably painfully familiar with. So this just asks students to take these three dimensions and put them together. There is a clarification statement, which I didn't read earlier. So emphasis is on a quantitative analysis and comparison of the relationships among interdependent factors, including boundaries, resources, climate, and competition. An example of mathematical comparisons could include graphs, charts, histograms, and population changes gathered from simulations or historical data sets. And the assessment boundary does not include deriving mathematical equations to make comparisons. I don't need you to derive a mathematical relationship between these things. We just are making comparisons between these things using some quantitative data set. That's really important. So the performance expectations were released, some time ago, and afterwards they put out evidence statements. So these are further clarifications of the expectations of these performance expectations. Now, we prior would use the evidence statements quite a bit in writing our assessment items. They're broken down into different subcategories to kind of build up to what students need to do. So I want to walk you through some of this. So this is the first part of the evidence statements for this standard, that's HSLS21. There are kind of two different pieces of the evidence statements. There's this representation, mathematical and/or computational modeling, and then analysis that students go through. So let's walk through the representation really, really quick. So what students need to represent, and in any assessments that you give students, and ideally instruction before that, we want them to be able to identify components from trends, graphs, histograms of population data. And they need to identify and describe that there are population changes at different scales, that there's data on numbers, resources, populations, and climate. So that's really, really important. They need to, we're just identifying the components in there. That's the first level of the evidence statements. And after that, they need to identify explanations that impact carrying capacity, and that may include that some factors have larger effects than other factors. Like even an incremental increase in global ocean temperatures is a significantly larger change to an ecosystem than like a storm that just totally wrecks a coastline. That the scale of the impact is very, very important for how big the effect is. The factors are interrelated. So one effect on one, one factor may impact others, and that may impact others, and that spreads. So we are seeing that with that coral reef phenomenon. And the significance of a factor is determined by the scale of that factor. So you see the cross-skin concept baked in here. You can see the DCI baked in here. And students need to be able to look at those components, those trends, graphs, histograms. That's all within that SEP. Okay, so the second piece of this evidence statement is that we want to kind of increase the rigor. And now you need to do things with that. So all of those were just identifications of explanations or of components or factors. And now we want to do more with it. So the further evidence statements say, and I'm going to kind of translate this for you so we don't have to read that. It's kind of a little text heavy. So from a mathematical and computational perspective, students need to use their analysis and a mathematical representation, so some kind of graph, chart, or histogram, to explain changes in time and changes over time in populations. So we're not just looking at the fact that there is a relationship. We want to identify a change over time. And so you need to explain that there has been a change over time, and that's related to these components right there. And the analysis is now we're analyzing representations and factors from those trends, those graphs, those histograms of population data. And now we're explaining how those things are independent, not that they're independent, but how they're independent, and use that as evidence to explain their effect on carrying capacity. So just to go through the different layers that are here, we're not just identifying relationships, we're not just identifying that there has been a change over time in populations, but all of those things are being used together to identify how factors are interdependent and they explain carrying capacity. So the ask of students in these evidence statements is tremendous. And so we're going in complexity. We're going from super high complexity and a really, really dense performance expectation. The evidence statements break it down a lot more. And then y'all in New York State have these beautiful things called PLDs. And I think they're wonderful because I think they provide very, very concrete next steps for, teachers and for folks like ourselves who are building assessments. So how were these created? So real quickly, I just want to walk through. The question was asked, what claim do we want to make about what students can do? And so the end performance is where we start. And so much like performance expectations, it's a performance. So, New York State was looking to build these end expectation end performances. And then, so what evidence do we need to see to, what do we want students to do in order to show this performance? That's really, really important. So those PLDs were built that show a progression of evidence, and that evidence is leading up to proficiency. So that this is different than all the other resources we've seen so far, which are kind of just like summative statements on what students should be doing at the end of a course. And those PLDs, so those pieces of evidence, are used to design purposeful questions to elicit evidence of proficiency. So for the biology, and we're just going to stick with this one ecosystems carrying capacity standard because I love ecosystems, and carrying capacity is super duper interesting, very, very complex, simple at first, and it gets more complex. So I get excited about this stuff. So we want to think about what kind of questions we can ask that elicit evidence of proficiency or progress towards that proficiency. So this is what the PLDs look like for that standard. That's HSLS21, interdependent relationships and ecosystems. And so first off, one key difference between the elementary, the intermediate, and the high school PLDs is that high school has 5 levels. Elementary and intermediate have 4 different levels. And so important for us, just in terms of our expectations of students, the assessments they're writing, that level 5 is above grade level band. So they define that as being, exceptional, distinguished performance. That is not what students are being asked questions about on the new test, and it's not something I don't think we should focus on, frankly. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm Xing out the level 5. What we're going to do is we're going to build up from level 1, 2, 3, and get up to level 4 to identify some differences between these things. So if you've seen these PLDs before, that's great. We spend a lot of time looking at these things to determine what the differences are in expectations of students. So I want to walk you through some of the key differences that I see when I look at these performance level descriptions. So first off, we're going to start with level 1. So level 1 says, use mathematical and or computational representation to identify from those provided a factor that affects the carrying capacity of a population. So I think the important part in this PLD level 1 is that we're identifying a factor from those provided. So that means right off the bat, multiple choice question, and I give you some options, and you identify a factor that affects carrying capacity. That's it. PLD level 2 is asking students to now describe how a factor affects the carrying capacity of the population. Now it's important because there are these and or statements in here. So for example, it says use mathematical and or computational representation to describe how a biotic and or an abiotic factor affects the carrying capacity of a population. This is important because we're not just looking at any factor. We can look at a biotic or an abiotic, and either of those will be evidence of level 2. So that's important because we're going to get into level 3 and 4 later, and there's some pretty clear guidance on those two. So for level 3, we're not identifying factors. We're not describing how factors affect carrying capacity. We are supporting an explanation of, a biotic or an abiotic factor and how that impacts carrying capacity. I just started cleaving that from these because it gets a little more wordy. And so this is really, really important. We're not just looking at identifying factors. We're not describing factors. We're supporting an explanation of how, like a biotic or an abiotic factor, a biotic or an abiotic factor that affects carrying capacity of an ecosystem. And that's level 3. So that's approaching proficiency. Now, level 4 is proficiency. So this is the same as something we were looking at earlier, and I'm gonna reveal that in just a second. So this says, and what's different here is that we want to support explanations of biotic or abiotic factors. So we have 2 different things. There's no and or at all in level 3 or level 4. So you need to look at biotic and abiotic factors. So they need to be more than one thing. So I just want to call out that supporting, so there's use mathematical and or computational representations. There's an S at the end of representations. So as was called out in the analysis of those initial questions, there were 2 data sets that were given, 2 different graphs. This text, there's a bunch of data in that text, and those are different representations of how carrying capacity is impacted by biotic and abiotic factors. So in order to meet level 4, you cannot have a single source of data. In order to meet level 4, you need to have representations. So there need to be at least 2 different representations of data in order for students to meet that. So as we're translating these standards into what we ask of students, if you have 0 representations, then you can't meet the PLDs at all. If you have 1 representation, then you can get up to PLD level 3. But for proficiency, students need to see multiple different representations of data in order for them to be able to support explanations about how those factors impact carrying capacity in populations. Fun. All right, cool. And again, the level 5 is distinguished performance. There aren't assessment items at this time that are written for that. So I would say don't even worry about that. Frankly, these are rigorous enough. This is what you should focus on, in my humble opinion. All right, great. Now let's talk about calibrating assessments with those PLDs. So now we're going to look at those PLDs and figure out what level of each of those PLDs do assessment items look like. And so I'm going to start with the PLDs, and we're going to look at that kind of what the performance expectation looks like. And so in case it's not been obvious or told to you yet, so that level 4 is the performance expectation. So these pictures are the same thing. So use mathematical and or computational representations to support explanations of factors that affect carrying capacity. And I'm not going to read it, but this is the performance expectation. So for the purposes of what we're going to go through in the next few slides, we are not going to consider level 5. I've just simply cleaved it off this image because we're not worrying about that. We're worrying about how we're leading up to this proficiency, how we're getting students to use the SEP, the DCI, and the cross-cutting concept all together. And so let's go back again to that release test item that we looked at initially on one of the first slides in the presentation. And we're going to figure this out. So in the chat, I'd like you to tell me, what PLD level is this question written to? So again, the question says, which statement most accurately describes the expected effect on the carrying capacity of a population of a change if a change in a factor occurs? And there are 4 different scenarios of changes. So what PLD level does this match with? And if you want to provide evidence for why you think what you think, that would be helpful, because I do think the reasoning here is very, very important. Okay, so in the chat, I'm seeing 0, which that's not even on here. It's a PLD level. And I'm seeing 1. And then I also see someone said closest to a 1, but they're not using a provided model. I would agree. So there's no mathematical, there's no computational representation, and you're not identifying factors. You're just identifying relationships. I mean, this is a level 0. It doesn't even fall on the scale at all. So I agree with you if you wrote level 0. Let's go into the new released items, and we're going to take a look at this. So now we're going to look at the new item that we just saw. And as a reminder, so the item said, use evidence from the information provided to support an explanation of how biotic and abiotic factors affect the carrying capacity of shell-building organisms, such as coral, in a reef ecosystem. I know that these graphs are small, so I'm just going to walk through it really quick. So we have a change in ocean temperature. There was a whole paragraph of information as well, and also changes in ocean conditions that affect coral reefs. So there's a couple different data sets that are given here. So what level PLD is this question? And if you can say why, that would be interesting. All right. So I see support 1 expectation, level 3, because then I'm providing more than one explanation. Level 3 because they're using temporal scales. Ooh, I like that, but not different scales. 4, there's multiple sources. They're looking at both biotic and abiotic sources. I see level 3 asks for 1 explanation. And so this question does say biotic and abiotic factors. So I see a plural S there, which I remember. So on that release test or on the PLDs, the S was important, because if we don't have an S and we just look at a single representation, then that's level 3. And if there are multiple different factors, then we're looking at level 4. The argument about scales is really interesting. So there aren't different scales. There's just a single scale that we're looking at. And I guess maybe we could consider the change in ocean temperature to be a different scale than the changes in ocean conditions that affect coral reefs. So I think you could make the argument that we're looking at different scales here, ocean temperature versus these kind of like micro ocean conditions, which are more, this is like a molecular level conditions. So yeah, it's I guess that I think the left one is local. The changes in the changes in ocean temperature are at a global scale. So I don't know. So I would say I think this is super interesting. I can see the evidence for a 3. I can see the argument for a 4. Absolutely. I think that the change in ocean temperature is intended as a global thing, and the changes that affect the coral reefs, and this is looking at a single coral reef. There's like a really discrete coral reef here. And so I believe that the intention here is to look at the global scale of ocean temperature, and then the sort of like micro scale of the local conditions for this one very specific coral reef that they use in the cluster. So yeah, super interesting. All right, great. See, this is why we have to discuss these things, because I do think that there's evidence for the 3, but I think the intention is there for the 4, because you're looking at those 2 different scales, temporal scales, where you're looking at over a long time, and then just this shorter scale. And I think that there's more information in the text that we're not pulling from it here. So great discussion. All right, y'all. So I want to also present you with a question from inner orbit, because this is always fun to look at ways that our questions align. To be fair here, I didn't pick one of our sense-making questions, one of our 3-dimensional questions. I purposely picked a 2-dimensional question to see where we thought this might fall. But this question says, so we give them, so this is all about worms and how worms impact the carrying capacity of different, I think it's bacteria within soil samples. Super, super interesting. And so on the right-hand side, we have this graph of microbial mass in different circumstances. And then, or in these are different, I think it's different bacteria. And then on the left-hand side, we have earthworm population size. And so there's like another diagram in there, but I don't think it's super important. The question says, refer to figure 1. That's the thing on the right. What would happen to the carrying capacity of the L. rubellus population if the L. terrestris population died off? And so is this a level 1, 2, 3, or 4? I try to make this brief too. There's some more information is given in the phenomena that's not present here. So you're going at this without the full context, which is fine. Okay, so I said 1. I see arguments for 1. It has the die-off factor. 2, because they're describing rather than merely identifying. So I'd be curious to know the die-off factor. How does that bring it to level 1? It's kind of interesting. Are they really describing is a good question. They're describing the cause and effect. It's super interesting. So I'll what happens to the cross-cutting concept, but not how a factor affects the cross-cutting concept. Carrying capacity. Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate it. Cool. So this is intended, and my analysis of this would be that it was a level 2. I can see the evidence for a level 1 if we're just looking at the carrying capacity and identifying a factor. So like population dying off might be the factor, and we're identifying the intention is to identify the impact of this. But again, so I know this is the same thing. The person who wrote the previous question that we're looking at is probably like, no, it's at different temporal scales because of this. And so I understand that there's a bias between folks that wrote items and folks that are analyzing items. So I really appreciate that. So this is intended to be between a 1 and a 2. Our 2-dimensional items are not intended to be level 3s or level 4s. Those are sense-making questions and free response questions. And so I'll go over that in a little bit, but I really appreciate y'all noodling on this and diving into it. Thank you very, very much. This is one of our questions that's intended to scaffold up to later questions. Again, I think that whether they're describing or choosing a factor is probably so for level 2, is it possible to ask multiple choice questions for level 2, or is it not possible to ask multiple choice questions? Because if it's not possible, then you can only ask multiple choice questions at a level 1. And I think that ideally, we're able to gather data by having students compare different descriptions and choose the description that works best. And so if your definition for describing is students writing out an answer, constructing a response, then it's impossible to do anything above a level 1. But I think that I believe that you can, and I believe the writers of the test will also agree that you can write multiple choice questions that ask students to choose the description, exactly as was just stated in the chat. So I think that's the intention in the design. Yep. Cool. Thank you all for noodling on this. I don't want to linger too long. Super duper fun. Thank you. I really, really appreciate it. All right. So now let's dive into some real low-hanging fruit. And this is using phenomena throughout a unit. So if you're talking about carrying capacity, if we're talking about anything within the scope of high school biology or living environment, we want to give students opportunities to use phenomena throughout a unit. So we're going to use this standard that we've been digging into, AHS-LS 2.1. And I want to give you kind of a quick roadmap for how you could use phenomena throughout the course of a unit so that you don't end up in a situation where you've been going through direct instruction and students get to that test next year and they're like, oh no, I'm freaking out because I've never seen a novel phenomena before. You've just explained phenomena to me. So throughout the course of a unit, I just want to offer some options. So for that carrying capacity standard, at first, we give students phenomena and go through a whole class walkthrough. So let's just talk about this phenomena. We can look at those worms and different bacterial biomass within a forest ecosystem. And I could walk them through it and ask them, what do you notice and wonder about how this affects this? And then in the middle of the unit, we can say, all right, like I'm going to print out a phenomena. So in orbit has lots of these, and I'm going to go through that in a second. And I can scaffold a little bit, maybe like go over the data sets for students a little bit, and then allow them in groups to kind of like dig into the phenomena. So this is in between instructions. So I'm directly instructing, and then in the middle of that, I can dive into these different printed and scaffolded things. And then at the end, we can have individual assessment where students sit down and they take a test on one or multiple performance expectations, and they attempt to make sense of that phenomena. So on the InOrbit website, if we're looking at the standard HSLS21, so we have 5 different phenomena for this. And you could use, the links between wildcats and hares. I thought it was kind of ironic that we had this, and that's one of the questions that was on the regions, was referencing this relationship. So it gives students some different predator-prey dynamics, how photosynthesis changes in different conditions, historical population data for the lynx and the hare. And then we have questions, if you're not familiar with this. So we have questions that focus on prior knowledge, going back to middle school MSLS22 or MSLS21. There's a few of those questions. We have questions that are one-dimensional. This would be equivalent to the Regents question, where it's not actually hitting into the PLDs. It's not supposed to do that. It's just supposed to say students know things. And then we ask questions. This is where I pulled one of those carrying capacity questions, there are 2-dimensional questions. So this is the cross-cutting concept and the DCI. We have a couple of those to give you 2-dimensional performances. And then we'll ask questions about the cross-cutting, the SEP and the DCI. So where students are doing some analysis of the data they're given. And then we have questions that are sense-making questions. And these are questions that would approach either the 3, some of them may hit the 2, but they're intended to give students an integrated approach to assessing the DCI, the SCP, and the cross-cutting concept, and using those all together. Then we have free response questions at the end. And those will often come with 3-dimensional rubrics, where students are being assessed on their ability to apply the SCP, the DCI, and the cross-cutting concept. So that could be your initial class walkthrough. And then you can talk about these earthworms affecting an entire forest. Look at that. This is the data sets we're looking at earlier. And then we have a whole other set of questions that you could use for this and ask students to make sense of another phenomena. And then we could look at oysters and how those populations change over time as well in Chesapeake Bay. Sad times. And then we could also look at the wood thrush and the changes in population, fledglings, immigration rate, population sizes. All this is good stuff. And the cowbird parasitism on nests. And then finally, we can look at hydrothermal vents. Yeah, and we can, Thomas, can you ask that question in a different way? I'm not sure what you're looking for, but I'd be happy to answer it. So hydrothermal vents can be a final analysis where we're looking at different bacteria, proteobacteria, and lots of other organisms that occur before and after hydrothermal vents become inactive. So that's fun. So these are just examples of phenomena for in orbit that you can use as some of these walkthroughs, explorations, or individual assessment. And let's say you're like, wow, there's no way my students will be able to access that stuff. Well, that's fine. You can go back to the middle school performance expectations. And for this PE, there are actually 2 middle school MS-LS expectations that lead up to that high school one. So it's MS-LS22 and MS-LS21. So 2 different performance expectations. So on an orbit, you'll find that if you hover over a prior knowledge, you'll see this is tied to MS-LS22, some of the first questions, or MS-LS21. And so we can search on the site for MS-LS2, there's a couple of different standards in there. And you're going to pop up with a whole bunch of different phenomena that you can use to look at carrying capacity and relationships between organisms and lots and lots and lots of other stuff. And these can be ways for you to, again, be able to explore different phenomena with your students at a lower level of rigor. So we're just trying to give you opportunities to approach phenomena with your kiddos. So Thomas, we'll send the link to Exploring in Orbit in the video description in YouTube. So if you go on YouTube, you'll see a link in there, and you can click to either meet with us or start a pilot. So you can explore the site as well after we're done. Cool. And if you're not familiar with InOrbit, so we do write really, really scaffolded questions, and the intention is to assess students' prior knowledge on different DCIs, their understanding of core content, their understanding of the cross-cutting concepts or the SEPs, and then finally of all 3 dimensions together. So we take a slightly different approach than the PLDs do to this, but it generates really interesting data. So when you go into your reports, you can see data on SEPs, on cross-cutting concepts, and on DCIs. And you can dig into that data and get a little bit more information and say, well, exactly what part of 6-8 were they successful in? Or exactly what part of 3-5 or 9-12 were they struggling on? And so the intention is to give you really specific data so that you can analyze that data and help your students. Boom. That's it. Thank you all so much for being here. The intention of this webinar was to kind of get things bubbling around, things moving around in your brains. I hope that we met that intention. If you're watching this as a recording, then feel free to leave comments in the YouTube videos. We do read those and respond to them. And if you have any questions, I'm going to hang out for a little while. But otherwise, thank you all so much for being here. It was awesome to be able to dive into these released items. And you can also follow us on social or subscribe to our YouTube channel. And I'm very grateful for y'all for being here to expand your practice and test your knowledge, and also for engaging. I really, really appreciate it. But thank you all very much for being here, and have a beautiful rest of your day.